Hi, my name is Joe Yates. I'm from LeanPanda, and today I'll be talking about DatoCMS, and more specifically about a new field type which is coming out today, which is the structured text field type. Now, the idea of this new field type is that we'll give editors a much more direct experience with creating content instead of doing what was previously necessary, which was creating separate blocks. You're able to work inside an editor, which will give you a much clearer idea of what you're going to end up with. We'll also be looking at how this data is produced across the API and how it will get rendered into the final format. We will be using the Firmo static site generator, and specifically we will be using the library which is used with Firmo to go and grab the data off the GraphQL API. So let's have a look at what this stuff looks like on DatoCMS. So I've just made an example project here, and I've created a couple of models. The central model is the article here. We have a title, a single line string, a slug for the URL, and here's the interesting bit, the body. The body is a structured text. So let's have a look inside that. So it's going to be called body when we search for it on the API, and we'll see later about the meaning of this. Anyway, you can link to these two models inside this structured text. And then another thing we'll be looking at a bit more in depth later is that I've defined a block type which can exist within the structured text. So if we go and have a look at what we've actually got in terms of content, I've made these 7 examples, and we will go through each one, and they cover from the very simplest example to stuff which is a bit more involved, and we'll be looking at the various phases: how you put the data into DatoCMS, how you query it with GraphQL, the results you get in GraphQL, how you render that GraphQL output as something for the end user. Here I'll be using HTML as the final output. You don't necessarily need to produce HTML, but this is obviously the most common use case, so we'll be looking at that. Okay, so again, let's have a look at this, the first example of an article. So we've got 3 fields we saw earlier: a title, a slug, and the interesting bit, which is the structured text area. Just to give you a quick outline of what you can do, that's not the purpose of this video. If you can obviously type stuff here, but if you hit / then you can start to do things like insert headings and other structural elements, and obviously you can also do stuff in terms of formatting the text, which we'll see in a minute. Okay, so that's my first article, and this article has an ID which is this number here. So let's have a look at how we can query that. Now, I've already got a query ready here. I'll show you how to build that in a minute, but we've got the same ID here. And so if we run this query, what we get is quite a lot of data. So let's have an initial look to understand how these two parts work. So we're querying for an article with a specific ID. Okay, and what we are asking for is the ID, the title, and the body. But for the body, because it's a rich text field, we need to ask for the value, and the value is the bit where we get all of the structured data. So let's see how that is equivalent to what we have over here. So here we have the ID and the title, nothing special about that, and then the body. And even though we've just queried for one thing, value, we're getting back a whole lot of info. So let's have a look at that. First, it says that it is a dast. Now, dast stands for Dato abstract syntax tree, and it's a registered format indicating how a structured text is rendered in JSON. The document which comes inside your Dato abstract syntax tree starts with the root and then is a hierarchical structure with children. In our case, let's just go back to what we're expecting here, hello structured text. All we have is we have a paragraph which includes one span, and the span has this content. So let's see how that comes out in this site. So here, as I said, this is an example of a Firmo site in development mode, and this is the first item. And so here we've put our title, and here we've put the result. Now the question is, how do we get from that to that? And the answer is that we use helpers. In the case of Firmo and DatoCMS, what we do is we use this library, and inside the DatoCMS GraphQL client there is a special set of rendering functions which handle the dast and will convert it into an HTML result. So here's the part of the library that's relevant to structured text, and what happens is that it provides a method to HTML and you pass it exactly that structure that we saw earlier. So you pass it this bit, and what it does is it recursively goes into your document and turns all of the different parts of the data into HTML. For example, here it wraps the children of a paragraph in P tags, pretty obviously. Headings, it creates a tag which is an H followed by the level of the node. We'll see that in a minute, etc., etc. So this code takes a dast and turns it into HTML. You will also notice there is a lot of stuff here about renderers, and we will see how you can handle custom rendering to produce specific results which are different from the standard version. So there we have the flow, which all I have to do is I have to pass my dast to that HTML function, and out comes hello structured text as a result. Let's have a look at the second example, text styles. Okay, so here, as I said earlier, you can highlight text and change it. So this part is bold, this part is highlighted, and this part is in italic. So this set of text has a whole load of different types of styling. Notice that this part here has two types of styling, which is bold and strike through. So let's do the same as we did before. Let's grab the ID for that, stick it into our query, and see what comes out. Okay, so there's a whole lot more going on here because there's a whole lot more styling. So from the value point in the table, let's have a look through. So that's the root of the whole thing, and then we have a paragraph, and that wraps a whole number of children. Inside this paragraph there is the word some, which is inside a span which has a marking of strong, which we render as bold. We have the word styled, which is highlighted, then there's a space as there was before, text, which is emphasis, and then there's a word which doesn't have any specific styling. The word integers is marked as code, cancelled is marked as strike through. Words, as we said before, has two types of styling, strong and strike through, and so on through to the end. Okay, so let's have a look at how that comes out. Here we have the text styles. Okay, that comes out as we might imagine. Now, again, what this is doing is that we're passing our dast into this function, and it's going through and it's saying, okay, you've got a span with some marks, and it's applying a specific type of mark to each section. What do you apply? Well, it says it here. If something is marked as emphasis, we use an M tag. Highlight, we use the mark tag. They're the standard HTML tags for all these types of formatting. Okay, so now we've been through two. Let's go right back and see how you actually create these. So let's save the ID and then get rid of this and start from scratch. And we can use the Explorer. So what we do is we want an article and we want to filter by ID, where it is equal to our number, and we want to grab the ID. Let's grab the slug as well, and the title. We weren't grabbing the slug earlier. And for the body, I want to grab the value. You can see there's some other stuff available here, and we'll be looking at that later. And if everything is done correctly, there we go, and so we've got the same result. So that, using the Explorer, we can quite easily put together our queries here. Let's go to the third example. Okay, so we want to make a link, a hyperlink from this part of the text. We type in our desired target URL, save that, we can see that it's been linked, and then we're going to take the idea of this, plug it in, and see what result we get. Okay, so we have a paragraph which has is broken into three parts, because there's the word A, there's the words linked word, and then there's final dot. The bit we're interested in is here in the middle, and what it says is that we have a link which has a target URL which includes a span with the linked word. Let's have a look at how that comes out. Obviously, our Elixir render is rendering that as a normal hyperlink. We click on it, we don't go anywhere because it doesn't exist. Now let's go back to the next example. So next, let's have a look at a link to an item. So what we mean here is that instead of creating a normal hyperlink to some URL, what we can do is we can link to another record inside this DatoCMS project. So let's have a look. Let's get an item, and I've only created one item record, and let's create a link to that. Okay, so it presents pretty much like a normal hyperlink as we saw earlier, but when we hover over it, we see that there's this UI which is very different, and this says that this is a link to another item. The way we link to that other item can depend. Maybe in a React Native project it might create some kind of transition to another view. If we want to render it as HTML, obviously we're going to need to make the URL for this link. But DatoCMS doesn't know what the URL for a link, for an item is. So that's something which is all to do with the rendering section. It's got nothing to do with DatoCMS. All we're saying here is this bit of text needs to be connected to this item. I'm sorry, I didn't show you the items earlier. Oops, let's save that before we go on. So here's the list of item records, and this is the one we just linked to. So an item was a thing with a title, a slug, and a standard text body. We don't have a structured text here. So let's see how our item link gets transformed. So let's grab the ID, plug it in. I've grabbed the wrong one. Let's grab the ID, plug it in here, and run it. So what we've got here is very similar to the other type of link we just saw. we have the sections of text, and then the part of the text which is linked, and then here it says we have an item link and we have the ID, but we don't have any information about that item. So we need to add something to our GraphQL query so that we can get the information about what to link to. And to do that, we go back into the Explorer, we open up the links section. We want to do that on an item record. Now, because I'm making HTML, what I really need is actually just the slug, because then I can construct a URL to that item. So for a start, let's query that. And so beyond what we originally had, we also have this extra section in the output. So this is something which is at the same level as the value, as we can see here, same level as the value in the dast, and what it gives us is information about the item which was mentioned here. There's a problem though. What we're going to need to do if we start linking to various types of other records is to know what record type we're linking to. So in here, if we put in type name, then what we get is something which says, okay, I'm an item record, I have this ID and I have this slug. And so that is all we need to be able to do this, because if you look down at the bottom of the screen, we've created a URL which is /items/ the slug, the item title. Now obviously the part which is /items/ depends on how my application works. Where am I going to put my items? What paths am I going to give them? In the case of this this project, I want to put them under /items. If I click on that, there's my items. But what we've got here is very much a custom part, because the construction of that path is very much a choice of the rendering area. So let's see how we actually create that path and how we actually do the rendering which comes out with this HTML and this URL. So here's the firmware project that I'm running here in development mode, and if we look at the helpers area, then we've got this method, structured text to HTML, which we're calling in our views. So let's see where that gets called. So let's go to the template for an article, and all the article is doing is it's doing the query we've seen earlier. It's calling structured text to HTML on the article body, which is the dast part, and then it's just plonking that result into the HTML output. So again, let's have a look at how that helper function works. So what it says is it's calling the library function that we saw earlier. It's passing the dast, but it's also passing a series of options. And what these options are renderers for things which can't be rendered in a default way. How do you render a link to a record is what we're looking at. What we'll look at in a minute, how to render an inline record, and then how to render a block. And so what is this render link to record? It's this stuff here. And this is exactly why we need the type name. We need to distinguish how to render an article or an item. And so all this function does, this is the bit we're interested in, it says, okay, the HTML you need to create if there's a link to an item is an anchor tag. The path needs to be /items/ the item slug. Then we put the title of the item as the text of the link, and then we close the tag. Sorry, that's wrong. It puts the actual text which comes through in the GraphQL record. I was wrong there. What it does is it goes and grabs this bit, the link value out of the first child, it goes and grabs that and puts it inside the anchor tag. Okay, and the result is, as we saw earlier, this. Okay, so that's the fourth example. So we've been through minimal text, text styles, standard links, item links, and now the different types of structures which we saw earlier. So we can have a numbered list, we can have a bulleted list, we can have a quote. Quote has the quote text and then the attribution, and then different types of headers. This is a level 1 header and this is a level 2 header. Okay, now all of these can actually have standard rendering. There's nothing specific about them. So in HTML, in our library, we have a standard way of turning all of these into HTML. Let's just quickly have a look at the query. Plug that in there. I'm going to leave the extra bit about items there, even though we're not needing it right at the moment. Okay, so here's the first bit. So there's the numbered list and its content. Let's shut down the Explorer, otherwise we can't see that properly. There is the first item in the list, the second item in the list. This is a different type of list, the bulleted list. Point 1 and point 2. A block quote, so the quote we saw earlier. So here's the text of the quote, here's the attribution, and then headings. Heading level 1, heading level 2, all pretty obvious stuff. And there are no links because we haven't got any links to any items. So let's have a look at how that comes out. Okay, so visually, obviously, it looks very much the same way as it looks on DatoCMS, and that's because this HTML rendering and this are very, very similar. Okay. Inline records. So instead of linking to a record, maybe I want to plonk something about another record inside the text. So what I can do is I can, in the editor, what you do is you hit slash and you say, okay, I want to introduce, let's say, an item here. Put this item there. And that means that in some way I can make a rendering of the item at that point in my output. Okay. Now, obviously this is a link. Sorry, this is a link. This is a reference to another type of model within my project. So there's no standard HTML way of rendering this. So we're going to have a custom renderer. Let's have a look at how the query works. Let's grab the ID, shoot that in there. Now, we know that this thing is an article, and we haven't got articles here, so we haven't got the necessary stuff. So we're going to have to add articles to our things here. Now, whereas with the item, we were only actually grabbing the slug because we wanted to make a link in that specific case. Here with an article, maybe we want to print out the title of this article. So let's put that in there. And we need the type name for the same reason as before, so that we can distinguish what we're rendering. Because if we need to render inline articles and inline items, we need to distinguish them. So run the query again, and down the bottom we've got the type is an article record, the ID is that, and that's the title. Okay, and so how does that come out? In the final rendering, it's like that. All we've done is we've put the initial text, then we've taken the title and put it in bold in the output. And the way that's actually done in terms of of rendering is here. So we want to have something which is an inline record of an article type, and this function, as we said, these functions are specific to our project. These depend on how we decide to present things in a specific case. And in the case of an inline article record, we put a strong tag, the title, and close that tag. So that's exactly what we've got here. Okay, so let's go on to the final part, which is custom blocks. So all the way back at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that inside a body we can have links to items and articles, we can have all the standard stuff, but also we can have a custom block. These are similar, if you know DatoCMS, to the modular block system, but this is like a single block that you can put inside. What's it got? This type of block contains a single line string and a link to an asset. I'm saying it's an image. There's not actually the correct validations aren't set up here, but it doesn't really matter. So we've got a text and an image. Okay, so let's go back to the content. Okay, so all we have is, in this whole structured text, is just an instance of this block. So we've said insert a block of this type. We've typed in the title, and we've chosen an image to place inside the block as well. Let's see how the query comes out. Grab the ID, plug it in here. Okay, so there's not much to show here, because what we're actually getting is that we do have a block, we've got the ID, but we don't have any information about it. Let's see if the Explorer helps us. So let's go into the blocks, and we are presented with something which isn't particularly helpful, because we need something which is a bit analogous to what we've got here. So let's just grab that from an example we already have. So let me just grab all of the correct bits. Okay, I'll put that inside blocks. Open up blocks again. Bit of formatting. Prettify that, see if I got everything correct. I haven't. Okay, looks like we've got a curly missing. So if the block is of the type that we have created, if you please notice the capitalization on this. So the block is called my article block, written like that, and the actual type is, the first letter is caps and all the rest is downcased, followed by the word record. So there's a slight difference between the casing of the name of the block and the type name in GraphQL. Again, we want the type name for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. We want the ID, get the title, and then we, instead of just getting the image ID, maybe we can decide to get something more. So what we could do is we could get the URL. So let's stick the URL in there. Sorry, that shouldn't be there. Okay, let's run that. So, as we said, here we need to have, inside our document, we need to have a block with this ID. We go down and have a look at the blocks. Here's the matching ID, the title, the image, and its URL. So that is the payload that will allow us to render that type of article. So inside custom blocks, here we get the title, and here we get the image. So we're just putting the URL. If we go back and look at how that is rendered, here's the rendering section. It says, okay, if I have to render a block and it's of this type, then div with an h1 title, and then the image with the URL. Okay, and that is all set up because of these options. So I set up the kinds of required renderers that I have, that I'm going to need to deal with in my project. I define the rendering function, and that will give me the desired output. Okay, so that has covered most of structured text in a specific context, which is the Firmo static site generator and its interactions through GraphQL. There are libraries for doing equivalent stuff with in the JavaScript world, so anything which is through React or other similar projects use those libraries, and you can do this very same stuff in those languages. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.